Quite often in my videos, the process of unpacking a fired kiln load of work is something I tend to rush through, but in actuality it's a longer task where the pots, the atmosphere and the temperature are all considered as the wares are unpacked. Before I can get to the unloading though, I'll explain the firing process, albeit in a simple way. I begin my gas reduction firings at 7 o'clock in the morning. The kiln is lit, and for the first couple of hours the temperature is increased very gradually. Then, at 860 degrees Celsius, the reduction atmosphere is initiated by increasing the gas pressure, the air pressure, and by sliding the dampers over the flues at the back of the kiln. Then, at about 1280 degrees, or when cone 10 inside the kiln is fully bent over, about 8.5 hours after starting, the gas kiln will be switched off and quickly crash cooled back down to 1000 degrees Celsius, before being sealed up properly and allowed to cool much more slowly for the next 36 hours or so. 2 days later, and it's time to unpack. In this video, I really want to go through the process with you in great detail, discussing each pot as it's taken out and showing you how I tidy the pots up by polishing their bases and grinding the lids in. I begin by getting some wear boards ready to place the pots on, and one good thing about firing in the winter is that the fired kiln keeps the studio lovely and warm for 2 days after firing it. Although in the summer, that's a completely different story. So, 2 days later, and the kiln is hovering at about 150 degrees. At this point, it drops in temperature really slowly, so I remove the bungs from the spy holes in the door and slide the dampers to be fully open. This will let out the last of the hot air. The door itself is then cracked open. Doing this is still rather exciting, even after firing it so many times. I of course know roughly what's going to be inside, but there's still always a few surprises. As most of the pots are still scalding hot, I check over the contents with a torch, just to make sure there are no disasters, and then usually I leave it open like this for 30 or 40 minutes to give the pots time to cool off. Typically, the bottom, especially at the front, will under fire slightly, resulting in some of the glazes having a matte quality to them, and this can even spread up the pots at the front, as during the firing when the door is closed, these pots are essentially right next to a wall that comes into contact least with the flames. So inevitably, I expect there to be a few cool patches. Heat rises too, meaning the pots at the top will always be fired to a slightly higher temperature. This also means that whilst I can touch the pots at the bottom, now those at the top are still very hot. There being cool spots at the bottom is why I often place refires on this lowest layer, such as the yellow jar you can see here, coated in yellow ochre iron oxide, or the pale green mug on the far left. As pots placed here often don't fire very well, I normally just save it for refires. And that matte quality pots sometimes have looks a little bit like this, meaning this angular mug will most definitely be fired again. And even if it's placed in the exact same spot, a second dose of heat will make this surface glassier and more interesting. Next, here's that narrow cylindrical jar that was coated with a wash of yellow ochre iron oxide. All of my lidded forms are separated with these small waddings, a material that if you'd like to learn more about, I'll leave a link in the description below to a video that's dedicated to it. The iron wash is brushed over a layer of crackle glaze that fired poorly initially. It creates metallic surfaces that are never quite the same, and recently some of these have been my very favourite pots, and it's proved to be a good way of salvaging work I'm not totally happy with. These are the pyrometric cones from the top and bottom, which during the firing are viewable through the spy holes in the door. As opposed to measuring straight up and down temperature like the pyrometer does, these measure heat work, which is heat over time. Each of these cone packs has cone 8, 9 and 10, and these melt and bend over, measuring very specific temperature ranges. And it's really these which I'm looking at to know when the firing is truly over. Clay and glazes need to mature at certain temperatures for longer periods of time. And the analogy I like to use is to think of it like baking a cake. Batter needs prolonged exposure to certain temperatures in order to cook all the way through, and it's much the same with ceramics. Here's a stepped mug coated in a pale green crackle glaze that's been refired and is now fixed. The white angular mug you saw me unpack initially should look a bit more like this in terms of gloss and surface interest. And sometimes on the bottoms of pots there are bits of backwash that have been plucked off the kiln shelves, and these will need to be sanded away later. Next up is a bowl which I lined with bronze filings, which you'll know all about if you watched my previous upload, and again I'll leave a relevant link down in the description below. One conclusion from that film is that these bronze specks, which are mostly copper, may very well look better in conjunction with a darker glaze. So in this case I'm coating the interior with a layer of black iron oxide, which should fire to a glossy metallic sheen, an example of which I'll show you in a short while. Directly next to the left and right burner ports, I normally see small pockets of oxidation affecting the colour of both the clay and the glazes. So in theory, this lidded jar right here should have a swath of oxidation on its back. And there we go, just like I thought. This is another addition I can never be sure about. Sometimes it leaves large marks, like this, whereas other times it's barely noticeable, or it leaves just a shadow of darker glaze. But if you were to fire this same glaze in oxidation, you'd end up with a pot that's entirely yellow. Here we have a very small, lidded jar coated in a really thin layer of a blue nuka glaze. I like the watery thinness of the glaze, as it really shows off the clay work underneath, whereas some of my other crackle glazes, which go on more thickly, can sometimes smother the shapes too much, meaning their sharp angles and ledges are often lost. Here are two classic mugs, in both dark and pale green, with hand-pulled strap handles and bases left bare. I've always quite liked the contrast between smooth and rough. This next bowl is just like the jar you saw at the start, although in this instance it's been refired 2 or 3 times now, meaning the iron has really started to become quite dramatic, especially where it all flows and meets together in the middle. Refiring the green crackle glaze always makes it appear a bit richer. It's also more transparent and has more flecks of iron covering the surface. This simple teapot is also a refire, hence the slightly more characterful surface. It's the sharp edges on these refired pots, which I really like. They begin to turn very lustrous, taking on a warmer tone as the rich iron clay beneath it starts to bleed through more and more, and I especially like how it looks on the sides of the handle. Next, here's one of the angular bowls I've been making recently, thrown with a curved interior and trimmed to have an angular exterior. This may very well be the shape that replaces my old, fully curved medium bowl. I prefer it, and I feel like it sits within my aesthetic better. Next, here's a bowl coated with black iron oxide and refired, like you saw me brush over the pot with bronze inclusions earlier. For some reason, I was under the assumption that black iron oxide would react and fire in the exact same way as the yellow ochre iron oxide I've been using, and despite them being very similar, the black iron oxide has left a much more consistent surface. And if this means I have to do less refirings overall, then that's a good thing. So I'll definitely be testing this more. Here's another iron-coated bowl, fired atop a rather precarious prop system, which helps me to squeeze more into this bottom layer. There's a number of pots here that need a few more layers of iron oxide brushed over them. I typically do this as soon as they're unpacked, whilst the pots are still hot to the touch, as this helps the iron stick nicely to it. This is something I've been doing increasingly more of. Yes, it is a bit more work and it requires pots being fired a couple of times, but it creates pots that are more individual and special, and they sit nicely amongst my other glazes. Here's a nice little stepped bowl with a generous foot that for some reason is really flashed quite orange compared to other pots. Its foot needs a good sand, but as bowls go it's quite an interesting one-off. At first glance this is just a regular dark green mug, but again for some reason the glaze on the sharp rim has really broken into this lovely brown band. It isn't always this intense, but I like how it contrasts the dark green beneath it. Here's a pale green teapot with quite a substantial step in its waist and a large lid that shows off the glaze nicely. I've been making and firing a lot of teapots recently, so expect a more in-depth video on that process soon. The feet of my bowls have changed as of late. They used to be slightly angular and show quite a lot of bare clay, whereas these new ones are straight and are glazed all the way down to the bottom. They feel a bit more like pedestals, and the pots themselves lean to being slightly more sculptural because of this, but I also think it makes them appear a bit more modern. At first glance this bowl was lovely, but there's a few patches caused by the glaze being too thin, which most likely is my fault, as I must have fettled it down too much, so I'll have to figure out a way to fix this and re-fire it. At least it's only surface level, so its lovely shape will remain no matter what. Another teapot, white this time, with a body that tapers slightly from top to bottom. I don't mind it, but I'm not too precious about it. I think this particular shape would have worked better in the dark green. Now here's a really special bowl. Sometimes pots carbon trap. That's what we call the black you can see around the rim of this pot. In most cases, this tends to be quite localized, so it's rare for it to encircle the entire rim like this. There's a number of quite disappointing blue nuka glazes in this firing, which I'm not entirely sure what to do with. Normally this glaze is more blue and much glassier, whereas here it's very uniform and opaque. There's a hint of blue, and it actually looks better in video compared to how it does in person. I might fire these again in the hottest part of the kiln, right on the top shelf, as that sometimes does the trick. I like the iron speckling these have, but that's about it at the moment. This shelf contained lots of angular bowls, both medium and small, all of which fired successfully. And typically, I save the tallest pots for the top of the kiln, as there's no way they'll underfire up here. This vase was thrown with clay that had some coarse ilmenite wedged into it, hence the increased amount of iron specks that are scattered across the surface. I threw this pot with an indentation in the rim at the top. This creates a slight point of interest, decoration if you will, as compared to the lip coming to a simple, sharp edge. Next, another vase made with ilmenite wedged into the clay with a tall rim section, which makes for quite a contemporary shape, I think. It's covered in lovely blots of iron and has a lovely glazed footwell too, something I definitely need to do more of. The rest of this kiln load was mostly mugs of various shapes, including another pot with a carbon trapped rim, so something went right this firing. The one pot I can never make enough of is mugs, and really what I need to do is spend a month making nothing but these, as they're always the most popular thing in my online shop. With the top shelf out, I can begin unpacking the last of the pots from the back, including... oh, how did that get in there? For those of you who don't know, last year I wrote a book. It's called By My Hands, A Potter's Apprenticeship, and it's about the process of learning how to become a potter from my perspective. It details my apprenticeships, how and why I was taught certain techniques, how I developed the style I have today, as well as discussing pottery as a craft both in the East and the West, the UK and Japan. It isn't a how-to book, rather I hope it's something a bit more personal and inspiring. You should be able to find it in most good bookshops, but I'll also include a link below to various places you can find it online. Here's some more trapped carbon. By the way, this happens when soot forms inside the kiln and settles on the glaze, which then melts and traps it. And with the last of the pots removed, I finished taking out all the props and silicon carbide kiln shelves. It's interesting how you can see the flames movement on the walls of the kiln itself, even on the flues at the back. The flames jettison up and then get pulled down and out through the flues at the bottom. And that's the kiln unpacked. Of course, I couldn't go through every single pot, but I hope this gave you an idea of what it is I'm thinking about as I take the pieces out. Here's all the contents, save for this board of bowls that have been coated in iron and are going to be repacked for the next reduction firing. Some pots only need a really quick polish, whereas others need a bit more attention. For this task, I use these Diamond Core Tools diamond pads to remove any leftover backwash, which is the white flaky stuff you can see on the bottom of the pot. I dip the diamond pads in water and then carefully sand away the china clay and coarse alumina mix. Once that's removed, I give the rest of the bare clay a very light polish. I don't want to grind away too much, as it's very easy to remove the flashed colour given to the clay by the kiln, but I do want to remove any coarse specks of grog that could scratch a tabletop or any surface it's placed and dragged upon. For most of the pots, this process of tidying them up after they've been fired only takes a couple of seconds. But there are other pots, teapots and lidded jars in particular, that need a lot more attention. If their lids won't come off easily, I'll tap them carefully until it comes loose. Then, to get rid of this coarse, grating sound, I use Chemico grinding paste, which I smear onto the underside of the lid, and then I vigorously grind these two components together until they fit. This is essentially carborundum suspended in grease. and it grinds away the ceramic until it fits perfectly. I should note, I only ever use this stuff on regions of the pot that are bare clay. It's never used on glazed areas. I then remove the worst of this paste, and if I were grinding another pot, I would simply reuse this paste over and over again, adding to it gradually if the pot needs it. I then use toilet paper to remove the worst of the grease, and then I wash these areas with hot, soapy water. If you are using clays like terracotta or any bodies that remain slightly porous, I'd recommend using a different sanding compound, as the smell of this stuff can linger if it gets into your clay body. This particular stoneware, fired to this temperature, is completely vitrified, which means it can't absorb anything. Lastly, I thought it would be interesting to discuss my 5 favourite pieces from this firing, as while so many of the materials I use are the same as are the pot's shapes. These ones still, in my opinion, stand on the shoulders of the others, and that can be for something very simple, like the blackened rim of this mug. It's a subtle change, and it's a gift in a way given to me by the kiln, as I didn't do anything to intentionally cause this. I suppose this is just a good example of one of the mugs I make, with the added bonus of this black lip. And the same, if not more so, can be said for this white bowl. In fact, the black lip on this looks like it's almost been brushed on. It's too perfect, and I only wish there was a way to reproduce this in such a controlled manner. Next, there's the metallic bowl, a refire brushed with black iron oxide. This piece really blew me away. The coat of metal is far more consistent than anything I've ever achieved before, and I love how the metal seeps inconsistently around the foot, the green crackle glaze poking through in places, remnants of what once was. And perhaps the best thing about it is how the metal on the outside has sort of created these 2 bands of colour. Next, there's this refired teapot. It's incredibly glossy and it shimmers, and there's so much depth to the glaze. It isn't just a flat green colour covering it. Instead, there are all kinds of gradients, and the rich, warm tone of the clay shining through highlights the sharp edges on this pot. The handle is comfortable to hold, and it poured well in the initial tests. And lastly, there's the angular vase, made with coarse iron ilmenite mixed into the clay body. I like how you can see what it does on the foot, without the glaze covering it, and there are a few places where the metal appears to follow the spirals in the walls of the pot, and I love where it blossoms into the more metallic spots. Despite the surface quality, it's the shape of this pot that really does it for me. I really want to try and scale it up whilst keeping a very refined quality to it, especially in the rim. In this case, the blue on the inside fired to a lovely colour. It's almost more vibrant than the glaze on the outside, so expect more of these soon. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed the unpacking of this kiln and the selection of my 5 favourite pots. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch. Let me know which pot was your favourite, and as always, I'll see you next week.